B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, August 8th, 2019. The cries in Dayton for Republican Governor DeWine and for Trump were do something, do something. And I certainly understand the demand by Americans who want to feel safer, who want the government to actually do something, take action, to restrict the availability of high-powered weapons. And I understand the despair that people feel. I feel it very much myself. And so my concern is that unfocused demands on a deeply divided Congress could result in actually compounding the problem. And it could result in a bigger police state operation in this country than we already have. And so as I look at this situation, I send a message of caution. Be careful what you wish for. Because when you consider that we are now in an election cycle, Trump and the Republicans are desperate to show some movement, but they are diametrically opposed to any restriction on what they call the hardware. So the only area where Democrats might be able to come together with Republicans to do something is to pass a law that's called domestic terrorism, to ratchet up the authority of the FBI, to expand the surveillance of the NSA. And we must be very careful. Already, we're hearing proposals to revive the bad idea from back in 2016 when we had a round of mass shootings. And Obama was promoting the idea that if you're on the no-fly list, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun. And they loved it because it rhymes. No fly, no buy. And I cornered my Congressman Jared Huffman about this. And I said, look, the no-fly list is arbitrary. It's unconstitutional. Nobody knows how you get placed on it. And even more, nobody knows how you get off the list if it's inappropriate. And this is just one of the proposals that is now revived. And if you recall, after 9/11, the Patriot Act was already written. It was on the shelf. It was in computer files. And right-wingers cobbled it together. The national security letters that the FBI is authorized to use, and the sweeping powers that have been assigned to the whole security state. We don't need to do that again. And I lead today with a great commentary, an article at The Intercept by Trevor Aronson. I've talked with Trevor many times, as you know, and I consider him to be quite expert on the issues of terrorism prosecution and the state of play of American law. He turns to Hina Shamsi at the ACLU. It may seem appealing to provide new authorities for domestic terrorism, but the reality is the FBI has all the authorities it needs to investigate and prosecute white supremacist violence effectively. And Aronson notes terrorism prosecutions are a decades-long story of arbitrary application, creating a lasting perception that these laws are applicable only to international terrorism defenses, and that's false, he says. A host of anti-terrorism laws are available to federal prosecutors, whether the accused terrorist is an ISIS sympathizer or a white nationalist, including laws that bar and classify as terrorism the use or attempted use of weapons of mass destruction, attacks on mass transit systems, and hostage-taking, among others. And he mentions the case of Cesar Sayoc, as I did yesterday, the guy who was just devoted to Trump. All those stickers on the side of his van. And my friend Olivier emailed from Switzerland asking if I was being unfair to Cesar Sayoc because I go to great lengths to expose the framing of the so-called domestic terrorism suspects who are usually Muslim or have foreign-sounding names. And Olivier, I do believe that Sayoc crossed the line and that he gave clear evidence of his intentions when he mailed those bombs that didn't go off to a dozen people, all of whom are on Donald Trump's personal shit list. So back to Trevor Aronson, he writes that after the El Paso attack, the U.S. attorney said it was being investigated as domestic terrorism, and the alleged crime met the legal definition of the term, which is defined as ideologically motivated acts harmful to human life and intended to intimidate civilians, influence policy, or change government conduct. And I agree that you can apply that to some of these recent incidents. But again, I caution the use because it basically is a license for abuse by law enforcement. And that's, we don't need any more of that. Aronson again, the analysis found, The Intercept recently conducted since 9/11, 268 right-wing extremists were prosecuted in federal court who were allegedly involved in crimes that appear to have met the legal definition of domestic terrorism, but only 34 of them saw the Justice Department apply anti-terrorism laws compared to more than 500 cases of alleged international terrorists. He continues, the way the Justice Department has applied the controversial material support law, which criminalizes providing assistance to terrorists, is a good example of the double standard officials apply to right-wing extremists compared to extremists with international ideologies. Since 9/11, the Justice Department has used the material support law only once against a right-wing extremist. But more than 400 terrorists with international ideologies were charged with material support. And it's a flimsy charge. When you cannot come up with enough evidence for a true conspiracy charge, you go to this flimsy argument of material support. And Aronson goes on to say some of the most intrusive investigative powers available to federal law enforcement aren't limited to targets of international terrorism investigations. So-called assessments, which allow the FBI to investigate and surveil someone without probable cause. And that's in my Fourth Amendment, yours too, can be used to determine whether a white nationalist poses a threat to public safety. It's not because there are too few laws, but rather because the FBI, since 2001, has been focused on alleged international terrorists at the expense of identifying and investigating violent domestic extremists. So I've linked to Trevor Aronson's piece. There's more, and I encourage you to read it and think about it. You may not recall Darrell Johnson. He surfaced briefly in 2009 as the author of a report when he was working at the Department of Homeland Security. But within a year, he had been purged because the Obama administration reacted very badly to the report that warned of the expanding threat of white supremacist terrorism. And the wounded Republicans who were licking their wounds after the big loss in 2008 pushed really hard. And Obama at that time was trying to curry favor with Republicans, trying to get bipartisan support for health care reform and his stimulus package. And so Darrell Johnson was expendable. And I credit The Guardian, based in London, for tracking him down for a recent interview. He says, for the past 10 years, our government has failed us on this issue. He said if we had addressed it then, there would be fewer extremists, fewer attacks, because 10 years removed from the warning, we would have mature programs addressing the problems. But the political fiasco surrounding the report created a chilling effect in the law enforcement and intelligence communities. It indicated that this topic is radioactive, and you better stay away from it. And he recounts the process, that once Obama won the Democratic nomination, that's when the threat started. We all knew that a black man getting elected president and him being a Democrat was the worst nightmare for both anti-government extremists and white supremacists. And keep in mind, this guy defines himself as a Mormon Republican and a goody two-shoes. He said right-wing extremism is a counterterrorism term. It's been in the lexicon for 50 years or more. The FBI had released public documents for 25 years using the term right-wing extremism, and nobody had ever objected to that. I never thought somebody would equate right-wing extremism with the Republican Party or the Tea Party or anything like that. Now, we are hearing calls for buybacks of so-called semi-automatic weapons. I know people argue over the nomenclature. Eric Swalwell, who bailed out of the presidential race wisely and remains a congressman, Democrat from San Francisco's East Bay, he proposed a assault weapon buyback program budgeted at $15 to $20 billion, and he said, yeah, we can take that out of the Pentagon. Now, I'm sympathetic to that. I think it would remove a lot of dangerous weapons. The political price would be steep, and there will be some people who will kill agents who try to buy back their weapons. And ultimately, we can't get them all off the streets. I accept that grisly reality. But I'm not against it. Also, we're hearing calls for what are called red flag alerts. The idea that someone who is considered to pose a grave risk to public safety would be flagged by a friend, a family member. And then what do? We call the Obama gun confiscation crew. Remember how that was talked about all the time he was president? Yeah, Obama's coming to get our guns. So I don't underestimate what it will take to address these issues. But we need to make sure that whether it's a red flag list or anything else, that it's transparent, that it's constitutional, and it respects the rights of the accused. And maybe you've heard, but the mother of the suspect in the El Paso shootings, the mother of Patrick Crusius, about a month ago, called her local police department. She said she was concerned about the fact that her 21-year-old son had no experience and a lack of maturity, and he had legally purchased a so-called assault weapon. Now, she did not ask them to intervene, so this is one of those cases where somebody feebly sent out a signal that could have been picked up, but was not. And then we talk about Texas. Law enforcement in Texas is more extreme than in many other locations around the country. And if we give them new authorities, how will they use them? Well, let's take a look at what's going on right now. The FBI and law enforcement groups in the state of Oregon have been monitoring opponents of a natural gas infrastructure project. I've known about this proposal for a liquid natural gas terminal at Coos Bay, Oregon, for years. My syndicated radio show aired in Coos Bay for about 5 or 6 years, and I heard from a lot of great people there. A few of them still listen to this podcast. So this is a long-running effort. The Trump administration has jumped in and said, this is a high-priority project. And so the FBI is monitoring First Amendment activists. And because of the actions at Standing Rock in 2016 and 2017, they feel that they have license to monitor people who have broken no laws, who pose no threat, who have made no, public statements about how they're going to blow this up or, they'll lose their lives if they have to prevent it from being built. Then we turn to Monsanto and its private intelligence agency. They operate their own fusion center, we now know. Again, credit to the Guardian newspaper and its correspondent, Sam Levin, in San Francisco. And he reveals that new records show that Monsanto had a multi-pronged strategy to target the Reuters journalist and author of a book about Roundup. Her name's Carrie Gillum. They kept files on her. They ran paid search ads on Google so that if you searched under her name and glyphosate or Roundup, that the search results would all be negative about her book and would challenge her credibility. They planned a series of actions to target that book, including writing talking points for third parties who criticized the book, directing industry and farmer customers how to post negative reviews. And they even opened a file on Neil Young, the outspoken rocker who released an album a couple of years ago called The Monsanto Years. Just like the FBI did with Louie Louie in the 1960s, the Monsanto Fusion Center evaluated the lyrics on his album to develop a list of 20-plus potential topics that he may target, created a plan to proactively produce content and response preparedness, and they monitored his Twitter account. We also know that Customs and Border Protection has been creating a database of journalists and activists, attorneys, advocates, who have crossed the Mexican border into the United States. And the investigation into this is expanding after a July 15 letter from New Mexico Senator Tom Udall. So these are just various examples of how the expanded powers that were granted to our government agencies after 9/11 are being abused already. And there are people who want more of that? But I have another astounding case for you. You may know because I've talked about Max Blumenthal's recent interview with Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, the nation targeted for regime change by the United States. And you don't think that those border guards should be, promoting the politics of the administration. At least I don't. But when Max Blumenthal and his crew flew back to the United States, Sergio Torres, who was with the group, was detained at Dulles Airport for more than 2 hours. This was on the evening of August 2nd. They forced him to open his cell phone. They grilled him about his political beliefs. They demanded information about his visit with President Maduro. Torres, who is a Nicaraguan American, had joined the group. He was there and stood for a photo with Maduro. And he's not technically a journalist. He's one of the people who had participated in the Embassy Protection Collective of the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington. So, quoting Torres, they said that while I was being held, I didn't have any rights. I said, can I call my lawyer? They said, no, you don't have any rights. It doesn't matter if you call a lawyer. And, by the way, you can't use your phone. You don't have any rights to do anything. He said they kept asking me what kind of relations I had with Maduro. I said I had none. The officer was asking, what was the conversation with him about? I said I just shook his hand and said hi. That's all I did. Torres said after he landed at Dulles, he was subjected to a secondary security check. Then 2 officers burst out of a room and took him inside. He'd been traveling with several other members of the group, but was the only one who was detained. I think they targeted me for being Latino, Torres said. There were no white Americans in the waiting room, and I was one of 2 Latinos in our group. And he said a Latino officer addressed him in Spanish, demanded to know how long he'd been a U.S. citizen, then began grilling him about his political views. And this is not the first incident. I've reported to you about the case of the American reporter Seth Harp. He writes for Rolling Stone. He was traveling into Austin, Texas from a city in Mexico, and he had a similar grilling by the CBP, whatever it is. And so we now have a pattern developing. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Billy Cook, Dick Atlee, Terry Paris, and Brian Carey. They each kick in $5 or $10 a month, and I invite you to do the same. All you have to do is visit my website, peterbcollins.com, and click on the menu tab. Then you'll see Become a Subscriber, and it's easy to choose a level of support that's comfortable for you, $5, $10, $20 a month. And if you take out a new annual subscription for $50, you're awarded a bonus book, Trump on the Couch by Dr. Justin A. Frank, the psychiatrist, or 2100, A Dystopian Utopia. Be happy to send you a bonus book. Dan Kovalik is a prolific author. He's written 4 books in the last year and a half. And the new one is called The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. In our conversation today, we talk about the Max Blumenthal interview with President Maduro. And in this excerpt that you're about to hear, Kovalik responds to the claims that the U.S. had no role in the repeated electrical blackouts of the Venezuelan grid.
And there's 2 things to be said about that. One is that to discount it is just ridiculous because everyone knows the U.S. has the technology to interfere in other countries' electrical grids, and they know the U.S. has a motivation to do so. But even if the U.S. didn't directly interfere with the electrical grid, what we do know is that the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed against Venezuela have directly impacted on Venezuela's infrastructure. And so even if there were infrastructural issues behind the electrical outages, you have to report on the fact that the U.S. sanctions have a role to play there too. So one way or another, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is responsible for those sorts of occurrences in Venezuela. Meanwhile, it should be noted, I just saw news reports today, in terms of food shipments to Venezuela, that a ship bound for Venezuela with soybeans was seized in the Panama Canal, pursuant to Trump's new embargo that he just announced this week. And so, the idea that the U.S. cares about getting food and aid to Venezuela also must be questioned. And I'll be very curious to see whether that news story makes it into the mainstream press today.
That's Dan Kovalik, activist, author, human rights lawyer. The new book, as I mentioned, is The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. And he comments on many aspects, including the most recent moves to impose a blockade and the embargo on a ship filled with soybeans that was headed for Venezuela that has been held by the U.S. at the Panama Canal. Puerto Rico may be stabilizing a little bit. Late yesterday, the Supreme Court of the territory unanimously overturned the installation of Pedro Pierluisi as the island's governor on Friday. They ruled that his appointment was unconstitutional, and they said that he must step aside. So then they swore in, I don't know that the court did, but somebody swore in Justice Secretary Wanda Vasquez. And there is speculation that musical chairs may continue, that Vasquez may refill the post, I think, of Secretary of State, in which case she could then resign and have picked her successor. So I really I have to say that the aspirations of the Puerto Rican people resonate deeply with me. I have friends who are Puerto Rican. And to watch them put all this energy into ousting the corrupt Rosselló administration and get poked in the eye by the same wealthy people who control the island, that was really insulting. Meanwhile, tensions between India and Pakistan continue to escalate. The Prime Minister of India decided on Monday to unilaterally change the status of Kashmir. And Narendra Modi addressed the nation Thursday night in India, and he offered rationales, saying that Kashmir is going to be safer, it's going to be a great tourist destination, as soon as they submit and accept the end of the special status that they've enjoyed since 1947. Meanwhile, more than 500 people have been detained in nighttime raids across Kashmir. Internet and phone service is all cut. At least 3 people have died in protests and altercations with authorities. And Pakistan has shut down a cross-border train amid threats to go to war with India over the status of Pakistan. So this is a very delicate situation, and I think we need some Trump diplomacy, wouldn't you say? Don't you think he could get these people together, and the incredible deal maker that he is could resolve it maybe in 20 minutes? Sorry, I get snarky sometimes too. So over in Pakistan, the Prime Minister, Imran Khan, he spoke to his parliament on Tuesday, saying he feared for the Kashmiri people. He's angered over India's decision. If India attacks us, we will respond. We will fight until the last drop of blood. The whatever war in Afghanistan continues. The U.S. is looking for the exits. Zalmay Khalilzad, who has served now in multiple administrations in that region, he's running the talks for the U.S., and he is claiming that progress is being made. Yeah, I'll believe that when the last American service member leaves Afghanistan. Latest report from the UN Commission on Climate Change. It's as dark as the previous ones. 500 million people already live in places that are turning into desert. Soil is being lost between 10 and 100 times faster than it is forming. Land and water resources are being exploited at unprecedented rates. Floods, droughts, storms, and other types of extreme weather threaten to disrupt and over time shrink the global food supply. Already more than 10% of the world's population is undernourished, and we know that a lot of migration, including from Central America, is fueled by droughts, famines, and food shortages. Closer to home, I'm a big fan of West Coast oysters, and we get Hog Island oysters here. They are commercially grown. In fact, the last 2 Saturdays I've been at events where fresh oysters and barbecued oysters were served, and I love them. But climate change is increasingly harming those oysters and could soon devastate the shellfish industry across California. Even moderate changes in water temperature, acidity, and dissolved oxygen make it harder for native and commercial oysters to grow their calcium-based shells, a situation that does not bode well for the future. Yesterday in Mississippi, ICE launched a series of raids at 7 different locations, arresting as many as 680 suspected undocumented workers at food processing plants. I'm awaiting word of how many management people were arrested for hiring those people who are usually called illegal immigrants, because those people wouldn't be working there and subject to ICE raids if the employers weren't breaking the law. Now, this was really done for show. Here's a quote from John Sandwig, former acting director of ICE under the Obama administration, and they deported a lot of people, but they did not use the massive workplace raids on nearly this kind of scale. And Sandwig says this is a high-profile way to send a message, create more fear in the immigrant communities about ICE and the immigrants' ability to live and work in this country. It burns an incredible amount of resources to apprehend people, few of whom pose any threat to the U.S. It's for show, more than anything else. But just imagine, if you're the child of one of those individuals, in many cases both parents were working at these food plants. They staged the raids in the middle of the day, and the kids came home without their parents. This is inhumane, and it is immoral. I consider it un-American. Yes, we have the right to enforce our immigration laws, but not in made-for-TV takedowns that are simply to score political points. I'm having a hard time understanding this one, and it comes back to my whole complaint with Twitter. Why won't they enforce their rules on the tweeter-in-chief? So a different Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, his re-election campaign is locked out of its Twitter account because they posted a tweet that included a video of what they claim is an angry left-wing mob at Mitch McConnell's home, wishing him ill. You know, he broke his shoulder or injured it, And so somebody there, apparently a woman, made some comments. They were videotaped, and then McConnell's campaign put it up to promote this false meme that you got angry lefties. And also it's part of this package where Trump is speaking up and representing white victims of racism. Now, this started when the McConnell account posted a photo of a mock graveyard that included a headstone for Amy McGrath, who is his opponent in next November's election. That's certainly tasteless. But the idea that McConnell, who would post a video of somebody who threatened him, and that violates standards at Twitter, they really got to get a grip on what their standards are and how and when to enforce them. Here's a tweet from journalist John Pilger. He visited Julian Assange at the Belmarsh prison a couple of days ago. He said, "Do not forget Julian Assange, or you will lose him. I saw him in prison. His health has deteriorated, treated worse than a murderer. He is isolated, medicated, and denied the tools to fight the bogus charges of a U.S. extradition. I now fear for him. Do not forget him." And yesterday we told you about Whitney Webb's excellent third installment of her series on Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted pedophile who is back now facing additional charges. And we know that his sugar daddy was Les Wexner, founder and chief executive of Victoria's Secret and the Limited and some other retail chain. But in the coverage in The Guardian and the New York Times today, they mention that Wexner has now accused Epstein of stealing at least $46 million of his personal fortune. But Wexner doesn't explain why he put Jeffrey Epstein in charge of his vast fortune. And one would suspect, based on what we know, that Wexner was a target of sexual blackmail by Epstein. We also learned in Whitney Webb's well-researched report that Wexner was a member of the Mega Gang, and that is a whole network of powerful, wealthy Jewish people who work together in certain circumstances to get Benjamin Netanyahu elected and to make lots of money for themselves. And finally today, you may recall, if you listened yesterday, I introduced you to the term Hatriot. And I'm having a hard time choosing the Hatriot of the day. Candidate number 1, KKK, Chris Kobach of Kansas. This is the guy who ran the Republican voter suppression schemes. Trump considered making him the head of, calling him immigration czar. But Kobach demanded a West Wing office, a jet available, and promotion to Homeland Security Secretary in the future. But what's fascinating is he has announced he's running for the U.S. Senate in Kansas, and the coverage doesn't tell me whose seat he's going after. I don't know if there's a retirement or exactly what. But I learned that 3 Republican members of the state legislature have defected to the Democrats, saying their former party has become too right-wing even for Kansans. So, Kobach, or here's candidate number 2, 39-year-old Kurt Brockway of Superior, Montana. He was attending a rodeo in Superior, Montana, the Mineral County Fair, when the national anthem was started. And Kurt Brockway was incensed because a young man standing near him had not removed his hat. So Brockway demanded that the youth take off his cap. We're told that the boy responded with an expletive, at which point Brockway grabbed the youth by his throat, lifted him into the air, and slammed him into the ground. And the young man, who has not been identified, was transported by life flight to a hospital in Spokane. The teenager had bleeding in his ears and a skull fracture. Now, that's really making America great again, isn't it? To pummel a young man for refusing to take his hat off for the national anthem, And could that have been triggered by Trump's lengthy tirade against Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee and got bounced from the NFL for his stand? I guess kneeling is a stand. Hey, thanks for listening to my daily news and comments. Share it all over the place. It's on YouTube, and I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.